Stop, please! He's my service dog! We didn't do anything wrong!
Stop citing and restrain that dog. Put your hands on his back now.
Police responded to wrong address. Tasered veteran and service dog, who answered door. The porch light flickered on at 2247 Maple Street as Staff Sergeant Daniel Rodriguez heard shouting and car doors slamming outside his quiet suburban home. His German Shepherd service dog Atlas pressed against his prosthetic right leg as Daniel opened the front door to see if he could help the same instinct that had made him a decorated medic in Afghanistan, always ready to assist when others were in distress. "Hands up! Get on the ground now!" screamed Officer Kevin Walsh, his weapon drawn and finger on the trigger as he and his partner stormed up the wrong driveway toward the man they assumed was their domestic violence suspect. The 911 call had been for 2274 Maple Street, 7 houses away, but in the darkness and adrenaline of emergency response numbers became meaningless and assumptions deadly. "Officers, I think there's been a mistake." Daniel began his military bearing instinctively respectful to authority, unaware that his attempt to help would make him the victim of the very system he'd served to protect. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, the real domestic abuser was continuing his assault, while police brutalized an innocent veteran whose only crime was answering his door. Oakwood, Illinois, 2025. The middle-class suburb of 25,000 residents prided itself on low crime rates and strong community support from military families, with tree-lined streets like Maple hosting the kind of modest homes where veterans could afford to rebuild their lives after service. The neighborhood's quiet respectability masked the reality that domestic violence occurred even in seemingly perfect communities, while its trust in law enforcement had never been tested by the kind of institutional failures that could destroy innocent lives. Staff Sergeant Daniel Rodriguez embodied the complex transition from military leadership to civilian vulnerability, his 36 years carrying both visible and invisible wounds from his 3 deployments as an Army combat medic. The IED blast outside Fallujah that had taken his right leg below the knee was obvious to anyone who noticed his prosthetic. But the traumatic brain injury and PTSD symptoms were hidden disabilities that made him particularly vulnerable to the kind of high-stress confrontations that could trigger neurological episodes. Atlas represented 4 years of intensive training and a $50,000 investment in therapeutic intervention that had transformed Daniel's post-combat life from barely manageable survival to functional independence. The German Shepherd's tasks included providing mobility stability when Daniel's prosthetic caused balance issues, detecting the onset of seizures through biochemical changes, interrupting nightmares and panic attacks, and performing the protective positioning that satisfied Daniel's combat-conditioned hypervigilance without creating social problems. Their partnership had been forged through 2 years of rigorous training that taught them to function as a medical team, with Atlas's presence enabling Daniel's work as an insurance adjuster while providing the psychological security that made civilian life bearable for someone whose nervous system had been permanently altered by combat trauma. Officers Kevin Walsh and Jennifer Martinez represented the dangerous combination of insufficient training and high-stress decision-making that plagued modern law enforcement, their tactical approach to domestic violence calls emphasizing rapid control over careful investigation. Walsh's 8 years with Oakwood PD had taught him to expect resistance and deception from suspects, while Martinez's 3 years had provided minimal education about service animals, veteran disabilities, or the constitutional protections that should have governed their interactions with disabled citizens. The 911 call had originated from 2274 Maple Street, where 32-year-old Marcus Thompson was in the process of assaulting his girlfriend, Sarah Kim, in a domestic violence episode that neighbors had finally decided required police intervention. The dispatcher's information was accurate male suspect history of violence, active assault in progress, but the address confusion that sent officers to Daniel's house would allow the real perpetrator to escape while innocent victims were created through institutional incompetence. The broader context was a law enforcement system designed around rapid response and tactical dominance, where split-second decisions were made based on assumptions rather than investigation, and where officer safety was prioritized over civilian rights or constitutional protections. The post-9/11 militarization of police had created a culture where compliance was enforced through violence, while accommodation for disabilities was viewed as operational weakness rather than legal obligation. Daniel's house at 2247 Maple Street was a modest ranch home that he'd purchased with VA benefits modified for accessibility with ramps and grab bars that made his prosthetic-assisted mobility safer and more independent. The home represented stability and achievement after the chaos of combat and medical recovery, a sanctuary where his invisible wounds could heal without civilian judgment or institutional pressure. The collision between Daniel's desire to help and the officer's assumption of guilt was building toward a confrontation that would test whether military service provided any protection from institutional violence, and whether the system Daniel had served would serve him when his life depended on constitutional protections that existed more in theory than practice. The evening had been peaceful until the sounds of shouting and vehicle doors slamming disrupted the suburban quiet that Daniel had chosen specifically for its therapeutic value in managing PTSD symptoms. His military training and medic background created instinctive responses to signs of distress, while his work as an insurance adjuster had taught him to investigate situations that might affect his neighborhood's safety and property values. "Atlas, easy," Daniel commanded as his service dog detected elevated stress levels that preceded his handler's decision to investigate the commotion outside. The German Shepherd's positioning was immediately professional alert, but controlled, ready to provide mobility assistance or protective intervention, depending on what they encountered beyond the safety of their home environment. The decision to open his front door was motivated by genuine concern and civic responsibility, the same impulses that had made Daniel an effective combat medic who risked his life to treat wounded soldiers under fire. His approach was cautious but helpful, prepared to offer assistance or witness information if police were responding to an emergency in his neighborhood. "Officers, I heard shouting and wanted to make sure everything was okay," Daniel called out as he noticed two figures in tactical gear approaching his property, his military bearing automatically respectful to law enforcement, while his medic training assessed whether medical assistance might be needed for whatever situation had brought police to Maple Street. But the officer's response revealed that they had arrived with predetermined assumptions about threats and suspects that made Daniel's helpfulness appear suspicious rather than civic-minded. Their tactical approach was designed for hostile environments, not suburban homes where concerned citizens might offer assistance to emergency responders. "Sir, step out of the house with your hands visible," Officer Walsh commanded, with the authority of someone who believed he was confronting a known domestic violence suspect rather than a helpful neighbor. "We're responding to reports of domestic assault at this address." Daniel's confusion was immediate and understandable, his attempt to clarify the situation hampered by the officer's assumption that his presence confirmed their expectations about finding the perpetrator at the reported address. His explanation was calm and factual, drawing on military communication training that emphasized clear information exchange. "Officers, I think there's been some mistake. I live alone here with my service dog, and there's been no domestic disturbance at this address," Daniel replied, while maintaining the respectful posture that his Army service had taught him to use with authority figures. "I came outside because I heard commotion and wanted to help if needed." But Officer Martinez interpreted Daniel's explanation as typical suspect behavior denial and misdirection designed to avoid responsibility for reported crimes. Her training had taught her that domestic violence perpetrators often appeared reasonable while lying about their actions, making Daniel's calm demeanor seem calculated rather than genuine. "Sir, we have reports of ongoing domestic violence at this location," Martinez announced with growing authority, "and we need you to comply with our instructions immediately. Step away from the door and keep your hands where we can see them." The escalation continued as Daniel attempted to provide identification and explanation, while Atlas maintained protective positioning that was both professional and non-threatening to anyone familiar with service dog behavior. The German Shepherd's alert posture indicated monitoring of his handler's stress levels, while remaining prepared to provide intervention if Daniel's neurological symptoms were triggered by the confrontational environment. "Officers, I'm Daniel Rodriguez, Army veteran, and this is Atlas, my service dog," Daniel explained while slowly reaching for the wallet that contained his military ID VA disability card and documentation proving his address and identity. "I think you're looking for a different house. I heard the commotion too, and it seemed to be coming from down the street." The critical moment was approaching as the officer's expectations collided with reality that didn't match their assumptions. While Daniel's helpful intentions and Atlas's protective training were about to be interpreted through the lens of tactical thinking that viewed every unexpected element as potential threat requiring immediate neutralization. The body camera footage that would later exonerate Daniel was already recording his calm attempts to resolve the confusion. But the officers whose assumptions had created the crisis were beyond the point where evidence could override their preconceptions about threats that existed only in their tactical mindset. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Officer Walsh's tactical training overrode his investigative instincts. His assumption that domestic violence suspects always denied their crimes, making Daniel's logical explanations appear as evidence of guilt rather than proof of innocence. The address confusion that had brought them to the wrong house was becoming secondary to their predetermined expectation of finding a violent perpetrator who matched Daniel's general description. "Sir, everyone says they're innocent and everyone has excuses," Walsh declared with the cynical authority of someone whose experience had taught him to distrust civilian explanations. "We have a domestic violence call for this address, and you're the male subject present. We need compliance, not conversation." Daniel's military training helped him maintain composure despite the growing recognition that these officers had made a fundamental error that could escalate dangerously if not corrected quickly. His attempt to provide documentation was methodical and non-threatening, but his movement toward his wallet triggered exactly the kind of defensive response that tactical training had programmed into both officers. "Hands visible, don't reach for anything," Martinez shouted as she drew her taser, interpreting Daniel's compliance with their identification request as potential threat behavior. "The dog is positioning aggressively. We need to secure both subjects before this situation gets out of control." Atlas's response was textbook service dog behavior during high-stress situations, his positioning between Daniel and the perceived threats designed to provide psychological security, while monitoring for signs of seizure activity or PTSD episodes that confrontational environments could trigger. To trained observers, the German Shepherd's behavior was obviously professional medical intervention, but to officers expecting resistance, it appeared to confirm their assumptions about dangerous suspects with aggressive animals. "Officers, please listen. Atlas is my service dog trained to detect medical emergencies," Daniel explained with the patient clarity that his insurance work had taught him to use when dealing with people who misunderstood technical situations. "He's not aggressive. He's providing medical monitoring because this kind of stress can trigger seizures from my combat injuries." But the explanation that should have de-escalated the situation instead convinced both officers that they were dealing with a sophisticated manipulator who was using fake service dog claims and fake medical conditions to avoid accountability for domestic violence. Their training had taught them that criminals often claim disabilities to generate sympathy or avoid prosecution. The crisis accelerated when Daniel, recognizing that the situation was spiraling beyond control, attempted to provide his neighbor's phone number to verify that domestic violence calls should be directed elsewhere on Maple Street. His movement toward his phone was slow and deliberate, accompanied by clear verbal explanation of his intentions. "I'm going to get my phone to call my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She would have heard any domestic disturbance at my address and can confirm that I live alone," Daniel said while maintaining the calm authority that had made him effective in combat medical emergencies. "There's clearly been an address mix-up that we can resolve quickly." But Officer Walsh interpreted Daniel's reasonable suggestion as stalling tactic designed to allow escape or evidence destruction. His tactical mindset, viewing every delay as opportunity for suspects to gain advantage over law enforcement. The suggestion of witness testimony was treated as manipulation rather than helpful clarification. "No phone calls, no witnesses, no delays," Walsh commanded while advancing toward Daniel with handcuffs ready. "You're coming with us for questioning about domestic assault reported at this address. The explanations can happen at the station after you're secured." The physical approach triggered both Daniel's combat-conditioned hypervigilance and Atlas's protective programming, creating exactly the kind of defensive response that officers had been trained to expect from violent suspects rather than medical reaction from trauma survivors. Daniel's step backward was involuntary medical response, while Atlas's alert positioning was professional intervention designed to prevent seizure activity. "Sir, step back and control that animal," Martinez shouted as she raised her taser, her threat assessment, concluding that both man and dog were displaying pre-attack behaviors requiring immediate neutralization. You have 3 seconds to comply before we use appropriate force. Daniel's desperate attempt to explain the medical necessity of Atlas's positioning was hampered by rising stress levels that were beginning to trigger the neurological symptoms that his service dog was trained to detect and manage. His words became slightly slurred as brain injury effects manifested under pressure, creating exactly the kind of impairment that made clear communication difficult. Atlas, medical alert. He's doing his job, Daniel managed to say, as his balance became unsteady and his cognitive processing showed signs of the seizure activity that high-stress confrontations could trigger. Please don't hurt him. He's keeping me from having seizure. But both officers interpreted Daniel's neurological symptoms as evidence of intoxication or drug use that confirmed their assumptions about domestic violence suspects, while Atlas's increasingly protective positioning appeared to validate their concerns about aggressive animals defending dangerous criminals. The body camera footage was capturing every moment of the unfolding tragedy, documenting how institutional assumptions and tactical training were creating violence against an innocent veteran whose only crime had been trying to help. The evidence that would later prove their mistake was being recorded even as they prepared to commit it. The moment of maximum crisis was approaching as both officers prepared to deploy electrical weapons against a disabled veteran and his service dog. Their ignorance about medical accommodation and address verification creating the perfect storm for civil rights violations that would traumatize multiple lives while allowing the real domestic violence perpetrator to escape justice. The catastrophic assault began when Officer Martinez discharged her taser simultaneously into both Daniel and Atlas 50,000 volts, coursing through man and dog, as they collapsed together on the front porch of a home where no crime had been committed, while 3 blocks away the real domestic violence suspect continued his assault uninterrupted by police who had attacked the wrong victims. The electrical current disrupted Daniel's already compromised nervous system, triggering the exact seizure episode that Atlas had been positioned to prevent, while the German Shepherd's agonized yelps echoed through the suburban neighborhood as his trained medical functions were destroyed by officers who had mistaken life-saving assistance for criminal resistance. Atlas, no, please, no. Daniel screamed through the neurological chaos that was overwhelming his combat-damaged brain, his words slurred and desperate as he watched his service dog convulse from electrical trauma that could permanently damage the partnership that had kept him functional for 4 years. He was helping me. Why did you hurt him? The body camera footage captured every horrifying detail: a decorated combat veteran experiencing seizure activity, while his service dog writhed in electrical agony, both victims of institutional incompetence that had transformed a helpful citizen into presumed criminal through nothing more than address confusion and tactical prejudice. Officer Walsh's immediate response revealed the depth of their error as he began attempting to control Daniel's seizure-induced movements while calling for medical assistance that should never have been necessary. We need paramedics for a subject who's having some kind of medical episode appears to be seizure activity complicated by taser deployment. But the recognition of their mistake was overshadowed by institutional defensiveness, as both officers began constructing narratives that would justify their actions despite growing evidence that they had assaulted innocent victims. Their radio communications described aggressive subject with attack dog requiring force to maintain officer safety. Language that contradicted the video evidence their own equipment was recording. Atlas's condition was critical and heartbreaking. The German Shepherd's neurological damage from the electrical assault, preventing him from providing the medical intervention that Daniel desperately needed, while his own injuries required emergency veterinary care that might not save his ability to continue service dog work. "The dog's not moving right," Martinez observed with growing concern as Atlas struggled to coordinate his movements. The electrical trauma having disrupted the nervous system functions that enabled his trained responses to Daniel's medical emergencies. "We might need animal control to handle the situation." Daniel's seizure was escalating beyond what his damaged nervous system could handle alone, the electrical trauma having triggered exactly the kind of neurological crisis that Atlas's presence and intervention normally prevented or managed. The irony was bitter, and complete police had destroyed the medical equipment that could have treated the emergency their assault had created. The arrival of paramedics revealed the full scope of the tragedy. As EMT supervisor Patricia Chen assessed injuries that represented clear civil rights violations, we have a seizure patient with obvious service dog whose electrical trauma appears to have been caused by law enforcement taser deployment. The victim shows signs of traumatic brain injury consistent with combat veteran status. The medical testimony was devastating for the officer's credibility, with professional assessment contradicting every aspect of their narrative about dangerous suspects requiring force. The evidence was overwhelming that they had assaulted a disabled veteran seeking to provide assistance rather than avoid accountability for crimes he hadn't committed. The neighborhood response was immediate and outraged, as residents who knew Daniel as helpful neighbor and respected veteran witnessed his brutalization by police who had come to the wrong address while creating victims instead of protecting them. Mrs. Patterson's testimony was particularly damaging to official narratives about domestic violence calls. Daniel lives alone and has never had domestic disputes. He's the kindest man on this street and would never hurt anyone, Patterson told responding supervisors while Daniel was loaded into an ambulance. "These officers came to the wrong house and attacked someone who was trying to help them. This is the worst thing I've ever seen." The darkest revelation was that the real domestic violence perpetrator had used the time that officers spent assaulting Daniel to escape with his victim, the actual emergency continuing unaddressed while police resources were diverted to brutalizing innocent citizens. Marcus Thompson and Sarah Kim were both missing when officers finally arrived at the correct address 30 minutes later. The institutional crisis was immediate and comprehensive, as Oakwood Police Department faced potential federal civil rights charges, while their officers' body camera footage provided undeniable evidence of constitutional violations that could destroy careers and cost taxpayers millions in damages. The personal tragedy was equally devastating, as Daniel faced potential permanent worsening of his neurological condition, while Atlas's service dog capabilities might be permanently compromised by electrical trauma, destroying the partnership that had enabled independent living and civilian reintegration after military service. The community's moral failure was complete as residents confronted evidence that their police force had tortured a combat veteran and his service dog for the crime of answering his door and offering to help with what appeared to be an emergency situation in his neighborhood. The transformation began when Oakwood Police Chief Maria Santos arrived at the scene to find her officers had committed civil rights violations so egregious that denial was impossible and accountability essential for maintaining any public credibility. The body camera footage provided undeniable evidence of institutional failure that required immediate intervention to prevent federal takeover of local law enforcement operations. What I'm seeing here represents a complete breakdown of police procedure, constitutional law, and basic human decency. Chief Santos announced to assembled media and community members who had gathered after news of the assault spread through social media. Officers Walsh and Martinez are immediately suspended pending federal investigation, and this department will cooperate fully with whatever accountability measures are required. The federal response was swift and comprehensive, with Department of Justice Civil Rights Division attorneys arriving within 12 hours to investigate violations so clear that criminal prosecution was inevitable. The body camera evidence made denial impossible while creating the kind of documented constitutional violations that required maximum accountability to maintain federal law enforcement credibility. The assault on Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and his service dog represents willful violation of federal disability law and constitutional rights by law enforcement officers whose actions created the very emergency they claimed to be addressing, announced U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh during a federal press conference held at the hospital where Daniel was recovering from seizure-related injuries. But the most meaningful intervention came from the veteran community's mobilization, with hundreds of former service members recognizing that Daniel's treatment represented systematic failures that threatened every veteran whose disabilities made them vulnerable to institutional prejudice and violence by officers whose training prioritized compliance over constitutional protection. The community response was overwhelming and sustained, with Oakwood residents organizing support that included legal assistance, veterinary care for Atlas, and advocacy that transformed local outrage into political pressure, requiring comprehensive reform rather than cosmetic changes that would allow similar incidents to occur. Daniel Rodriguez opened his door to help police officers who needed assistance, and they thanked him by torturing him and his service dog, declared Marine veteran Robert Chin during the emergency city council meeting that drew over 500 attendees. This community will hold these officers and this department accountable for violations that betrayed everything we claim to believe about supporting those who served. The institutional changes were immediate and comprehensive, with Oakwood implementing emergency reforms that included mandatory address verification procedures, enhanced training on service animal law and veteran accommodation, and civilian oversight that would prevent future incidents through accountability, rather than just policy statements. The legal resolution was swift and decisive, with officers Walsh and Martinez facing federal civil rights charges, carrying potential sentences of up to 12 years in prison for crimes that video evidence made undeniable. Their prosecution sent clear messages throughout law enforcement about consequences for violating constitutional rights of disabled veterans. Daniel's recovery was gradual but ultimately successful, with months of rehabilitation addressing both seizure-related injuries and the psychological trauma of being assaulted by officers he had tried to help. The VA provided comprehensive medical support, while veteran organizations ensured he received specialized care for service-connected conditions that had been exacerbated by police brutality. Atlas's rehabilitation became a symbol of resilience and hope, with veterinary neurologists documenting gradual recovery of his service dog functions, while his bond with Daniel actually strengthened through their shared trauma. The partnership that officers had tried to destroy through ignorance emerged more determined to prove that service animal relationships could survive institutional violence. The most powerful moment came when the real domestic violence victims, Sarah Kim and Marcus Thompson, were located and provided testimony that completely vindicated Daniel, while exposing how police incompetence had allowed actual crimes to continue while innocent citizens were brutalized for trying to help. While police were torturing Daniel Rodriguez for answering his door, my boyfriend was continuing to beat me because no one came to the right address, Sarah testified during federal court proceedings. Daniel is a hero who tried to help, while the real criminal escaped because officers couldn't read house numbers correctly. The educational impact was immediate and far-reaching, with Daniel's case becoming required study in police academies throughout Illinois, while his experience influenced federal training requirements that address verification, service animal recognition, and veteran accommodation as core law enforcement competencies. The policy changes extended statewide as Illinois Governor Patricia Williams signed the Daniel Rodriguez Veteran Protection Act, creating criminal penalties for law enforcement officers who violated service animal rights, while mandating specialized training on veteran disabilities and accommodation requirements. The legislation was bipartisan and overwhelming, reflecting public outrage that transcended political boundaries. The federal civil rights settlement provided Daniel with $5.8 million in damages while funding ongoing monitoring of Oakwood police practices to ensure reforms were implemented rather than merely promised. The financial accountability sent clear messages about the cost of constitutional violations while providing Daniel with resources for recovery and advocacy. The community healing was facilitated through initiatives that brought together law enforcement veterans and disability advocates in collaborative efforts to prevent similar incidents while supporting those who had been traumatized by institutional failures. The programs created ongoing dialogue that transformed police-community relations from adversarial to collaborative. The research that emerged from documenting Daniel's case influenced academic understanding of law enforcement training failures and the effectiveness of body camera evidence in holding officers accountable for constitutional violations. The findings contributed to police reform initiatives while validating the importance of technological oversight in protecting citizen rights. 3 years later, Oakwood had become a national model for veteran accommodation and disability rights protection, with police practices that exceeded federal requirements while creating trust between law enforcement and vulnerable populations who had previously been targets rather than beneficiaries of police services. The annual Daniel Rodriguez Constitutional Rights Day became a national observance that honored veterans while educating law enforcement about accommodation obligations and constitutional protections. The event attracted participants from throughout the country while generating economic activity that demonstrated how moral leadership could create positive change. The transformation was personal as well as institutional, with Daniel's advocacy work influencing federal policy, while his recovery proved that trauma survivors could channel their experiences into positive change when supported by communities committed to justice rather than merely order. The Atlas Foundation, established with settlement funds and community donations, became the premier organization providing service animals to disabled veterans while advocating for accommodation rights that protected vulnerable populations from institutional discrimination and violence. The final scene was both vindication and new beginning, as Daniel stood with Atlas, now fully recovered and working as both service dog and therapy animal, at the dedication of Oakwood's Daniel Rodriguez Veterans Assistance Center, a facility that provided comprehensive support for disabled veterans while training law enforcement in accommodation excellence. Atlas and I didn't choose to become symbols of what happens when good intentions meet institutional failure. Daniel reflected during the dedication ceremony, attended by hundreds of supporters who had followed their journey from assault to advocacy. But we chose to transform our trauma into education that protects other veterans from experiencing what we survived. Sometimes the greatest service happens after the uniform comes off, when we use our experiences to build communities that honor rather than harm those who served. The audience, including Chief Santos, who had implemented the reforms, federal officials who had prosecuted the officers, and disability advocates whose work had been inspired by Daniel's courage, understood that they were witnessing transformation of individual trauma into institutional change that proved constitutional principles could overcome even the most entrenched discrimination when communities demanded accountability over convenience. The Daniel Rodriguez and Atlas incident became a watershed moment for law enforcement training and constitutional accountability, establishing legal precedents and police reform requirements that protected thousands of disabled veterans, while fundamentally changing how officers approached address verification service animal encounters and interactions with vulnerable populations. The immediate consequences revolutionized police training nationwide, with the Department of Justice mandating comprehensive address verification procedures and disability accommodation education for all federally funded law enforcement agencies within 12 months. The program reached over 750,000 officers, while preventing countless incidents through enhanced understanding of constitutional obligations and basic investigative competency. The federal prosecutions established the first criminal convictions specifically targeting law enforcement officers who violated disability accommodation rights, with officers Walsh and Martinez receiving federal prison sentences of 8 and 6 years, respectively. The prosecution sent clear messages throughout law enforcement that constitutional violations against disabled veterans would face maximum criminal consequences. The Address Verification and Veteran Protection Act created federal standards requiring double confirmation of addresses before tactical approaches, while mandating specialized training on service animal law and veteran disabilities. The legislation influenced international law enforcement policy while providing legal framework that protected disabled citizens from institutional incompetence and violence. The police reform movement gained national momentum through Daniel's case, with his body camera evidence demonstrating how technological oversight could hold officers accountable when traditional supervision failed. The model influenced federal requirements for police body cameras while creating new standards for evidence preservation and review. The law enforcement training revolution extended beyond address verification to encompass comprehensive constitutional education that emphasized investigation over assumption, with Daniel's case becoming required study for police academy certification. The training influenced professional standards while establishing accountability measures that recognized constitutional protection as core law enforcement responsibility. The veteran advocacy transformation was equally significant, with Daniel's experience inspiring new organizations focused specifically on protecting disabled veterans from institutional discrimination. The movement influenced federal veteran services while creating legal assistance programs that addressed civil rights violations as veteran issues requiring specialized support. The cultural impact challenged fundamental assumptions about police authority and citizen rights, with Daniel's story demonstrating that constitutional protections meant nothing without enforcement mechanisms that held officers accountable for violations. The narrative influenced public policy debates while inspiring community oversight initiatives that prioritized rights protection over law enforcement convenience. The medical research that documented Daniel and Atlas's recovery contributed to treatment protocols for electrical trauma and service animal rehabilitation, while advancing understanding of how institutional violence affected therapeutic relationships. The findings influenced VA medical practice, while validating the essential nature of service animal partnerships for disabled veteran independence. The international influence extended to allied nations whose law enforcement agencies adopted similar address verification and disability accommodation protocols based on lessons learned from American institutional failures. The model influenced police training in Canada, Australia, and European Union countries, while establishing global standards for protecting disabled citizens from law enforcement incompetence. The enduring message transcended individual tragedy to encompass fundamental truths about constitutional governance. Police authority required constitutional limits enforced through accountability. Rather than trust, disabled veterans earned protection rather than persecution through their service, and the strongest institutions were those that admitted errors while implementing changes that prevented their repetition.